Hey, hello and welcome. So today will be our last lesson. We'll be talking about program evaluation. So what is program evaluation? How does that compare to research? Program evaluation is the systematic collection of information about a specific program's activities, characteristics, and outcomes. And it's used to make judgments about the program, how effective it is, and how it might need to be changed for the future. When I say programs, that's a broad spectrum of things, right? But usually when I'm talking about programs, I'm talking about things like nonprofits or services that are designed for people to use. So this can be anything from something like a nonprofit dedicated to serving a certain group of people or need in a community, but this also applies for stuff like marketing and business programs that they're trying to make sure they are assessing so that they can continue strengthening over time and making sure they're reaching their actual audience, that sort of thing. So as a comparison to research, and there's some really notable differences, mostly is that research is trying to create a generalizable set of knowledge. That's why we talk so much about who is our sample. Is it generalizable? Does it represent the holistic group that we are trying to make a conclusion about? Research is trying to expand what is known. Research is systematic, and there are sets of standards that we've talked about all semester, most notably through peer review. So you can't just publish science on your own. You have to have other experts in the field cross-checking you to make sure that everything is up to scientific standards before it can be published in a peer-reviewed article and be considered science. Program evaluation is totally different. Program evaluation doesn't have any of those checks and balances. It is really based on practical knowledge for a specific program or a specific reason. And it's trying to answer specific local applied questions, usually trying to improve a service or program, or try to justify why it exists to begin with. So really key differences in that. And I know this sounds silly, but I will also say professionally, I spent about 7 years as a program evaluation manager for a national nonprofit. And it shocked me at first how different research is from program evaluation. And that scientific component, it's not that program evaluation isn't scientific all of the time, it's that there's totally different standards for what that is or how you go about it. So here's some recap again of the differences. Research, like we said, is really trying to get that generalizable knowledge. We spend a lot of time thinking about our research design to make sure that our findings are applicable to a broader group of people. It is usually theory driven, meaning it is building on previous research using a certain set of concepts to discuss a phenomena. Theory does not mean, oh, I'm just making it up. Theory, again, means that it is a set of concepts we agree to use to discuss a certain phenomena. And the audience is academic, it's scientific, it's other scientists. It is, as you have found out, not very common that people even know how to find academic research, let alone cite it. So when people say they're doing their research, what they usually mean is they're Googling something and reading some of the top results. When I say we're doing our research, I mean we're going onto academic peer-reviewed journals and finding research that has been through the peer review process and then analyzing that. Different. So very different standards. That replicability, as we talked about throughout our semester, is very key in research, and that emphasis on control and research design. And that's compared to program evaluation. So again, this is very action-based on a specific context, a specific scope, and the audience isn't the academic community. Here, the audience are program stakeholders, which are people who fund the program, the people who work at the program, the clients that the program is seeking to serve. And the standards are less focused on things like replicability or scientific rigor and more on how useful is this? How useful and feasible is this information? But there's also quite a bit of overlap. Both of them use systematic approaches, and they use a lot of the same research methods in terms of surveys and data analysis. And they're both trying to find reliable and valid findings to answer problems or questions in the world. Grants are a big part of nonprofits, and they are a big part of program evaluation for that reason. So grants are competitive funding for specific types of programs, projects, sometimes research, and these are typically awarded by governments, nonprofits, or private foundations. But the government is very much the largest source of grants in most countries, and I'm most familiar with the US, so I can tell you in the US it is mostly through governments. Even the governments tend to fund the nonprofits, and so while you can get grants through nonprofits, the home of the money is still the government. Um, and there are some private foundations as well, of course. Grant writing is a very key part of this. It is a whole skill. What you have been doing in this class is research writing. It is transferable into grant writing, but it is a different ballgame, most definitely. And it is the process of proposing a project and trying to get something funded. I have a pretty good amount of grant writing experience, and I'll tell you, there's definitely an art to it. And a big part of it is evaluation. That if someone's going to give you money for something, they don't just want to know what you're going to do. They want to know how you're going to prove that it's effective and how you're going to prove that it is actually doing what you say it's going to do and doing it well. So strong proposals for grants almost always include program evaluation. And that's something people mess up when they're earlier in their academic careers and trying to get grants. They don't understand how important program evaluation is or how that might be different than research. So overall, these things are very tied together. Like I said, program evaluation is very important to funders. It is very important to most large grants. They're going to have questions about who are you serving? What resources are you actually developing? How quickly is that happening? Are people happy with them? Are they doing what you think they're going to do? And if you want to continue getting grant funding for your project, you gotta have some evaluation along the way most of the time. So it strengthens the overall efficacy of different programs to be systematically evaluating it along the way. I have a Grant 101 video here as well that I really like for anyone who might be interested. If there's any part of you that is thinking about working in the community, if you imagine yourself building resources, grant writing is going to be a part of your future unless you happen to be independently wealthy, in which case, awesome for you. That is not how most of us exist. So grants can be really helpful if you see yourself going in that direction. Good place to start this video. Very small entry point to what is a world of grant writing. So who funds grants for behavioral science projects? Largely, again, government agencies, most notably the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, and Substance Use and Mental Health Service Administration. Those tend to be some of the bigger ones within behavioral sciences. There are other components. There is a lot, as I speak today, there is a lot of change happening in our sociopolitical climate that are impacting things like grants. It's part of why academic universities and hubs are very attuned to the changes in grant funding because this is a very large basis for a lot of academic research. It's grants. It's a big part of being a tenured professor as well as expectation you get grants. And in behavioral sciences, these tend to be the big three. There's also some really big private foundations that you see listed here. There are lots of other ones as well, but these are just some of the big hitters within behavioral sciences. There are different funding priorities, and so you have heard me talk about this throughout, but to reiterate, what research exists is very much tied to who's going to pay for that research. So it's really hard for, like, I have a PhD in counseling psychology. I have the skills to do this research. I have the skills for grant writing, yada, yada, yada. Let's say I just really want to do some research on something like why men don't seek help for therapy as much as women do, which is a statistic we talk about a lot in my neck of the world. I can't just decide to start that research. You have to be tied to an organization, usually a university or some sort of nonprofit, and you usually have to have money, and not only to pay the researchers themselves, because it takes a whole lot of time to do this work, and people usually have higher degrees specializing in it. So I would like to get paid for that work. You don't make a lot, but I would like to be able to baseline. exist off of that, it means I need money. And if I need money, I need a grant. And if I need a grant, I need to find a grant that is funding my help-seeking research. So one of the first things you do is look at what government agencies or private foundations are funding what topics. Some really common funding priorities right now, and again, this has actually really changed in the past couple of months. We'll find out together where the world goes. But right now, mental health interventions are a big part of funding priorities, particularly around substance use prevention. How do we prevent people from becoming addicted to different substances? And how do we help them if they do become addicted? There's also quite a bit of funding for behavior change programs. So things like smoking cessation, exercise promotion. There tends to be more funding for things that are physical health and mental health overlap. So again, like that smoking or movement components tend to be a little more competitive for funding. There's also different educational innovations. So how can we teach things better? How can we make our professors more effective? How can we make our public educators more effective? How can we make sure we're training people appropriately to get those good outcomes? And there's quite a few community health initiatives that are a focus as well. Again, this is changing pretty rapidly in our current landscape, but typically this is the sort of funding that exists. Key takeaways is that who funds what and what they want to fund very much impacts real world innovation. If no one is funding cancer research, we aren't going to make any progress towards helping people with cancer. If no one is funding substance use research, we're not going to make any progress on how we can better prevent and then treat substance use issues. If no one is funding, how can we help people in poor areas achieve education at the same level as people who have higher financial resources? Then that won't ever change. So funding, who funds and what they fund is actually really important to how we progress everything from technology to medicine to research and what we know about people and communities in general. And strong research proposals, strong grant proposals are almost always tied to existing research and those practical solutions. So when you write a grant, the first part of it is, hey, here's what research says is the problem. Here's the gap we have identified. And then you tie in community data of here's how many people are in this community, here's how many health outcomes they're reporting, whatever is relevant. And you're crafting an argument for why you need this money to solve a certain problem. Then you have to come in and do that program evaluation to make sure you're being successful in the thing you said you were going to do. Grants, very important. So benefits of program evaluation. Again, this is kind of recapping some of it, but the big one is making sure that the programs stay true to what their goals are. So if you get a bunch of money from the government to do something, you want to make sure you're staying on track with doing the thing you promised that you were going to do with that money. And continually doing program evaluation rather than just at the end of the grant is really important to make sure you're staying on the right track rather than just reporting, whoopsie, we've been doing this grant for 5 years and because we didn't do an evaluation, we didn't realize we were off track. No, you should really be doing it along the way. It's very helpful for efficacy, so identifying what is working and more importantly, what is not working. Might not even be more important. They're pretty equally important. We want to know what's working, what's not working. It helps us make sure that we are using our time, our effort, our money effectively. Because money is precious, especially in behavioral sciences, which tend to be a little bit more focused on improving community and health outcomes. We want to make sure that what we're spending money on is actually working. And we also want to make sure that we are developing new and innovative approaches that can help us address different issues in our world. And that evaluation helps us test those different creative approaches before we spend way too much money or time or resources in developing them. And lastly, honestly, it helps you continue getting grants. So the stronger your evaluation is during a program, the more competitive you tend to be in continuing that funding. So for example, I said I worked for a nonprofit for 7 years. We have to get grant funding every 3 years. So at any given point, I'm either writing a grant, trying to make sure we get money for the future. I'm trying to prove that our grant is currently working, Or I'm trying to recap saying, okay, you gave us money for 3 years, here's all the outcomes. And simultaneously, here's why these outcomes show that we have all this work left to do, and here's how much money I would need to be able to do that work. So it helps with both accountability, but it's also that impact to funders. So program evaluation is very tied to funding. And there are certain things you want to consider. So first is you want to make sure when you're designing a program that you have very clear purposes. This is what I'm doing with this money. This is the intent. These are the goals of this program. And we want to make sure we are specifying how we're going to measure our achievement of those goals. Again, it's going to address real world complexities. So programs operate in very messy environments. I don't know if you noticed, but the world is messy and it's changing all of the time. So a really key part of program evaluation is you have to be able to plan for things going wrong. You have to be able to plan for staffing issues, for participant dropouts, for unexpected events. You have to be able to pivot and adapt what your program is and how you are evaluating it. So a really good example of that is I worked with a nonprofit that was designed to help people with physical disabilities. And historically, we did program evaluations in person. We had a conference every year. People would come in person in conference. We would give them surveys, ask about satisfaction, that sort of thing. And then COVID happened. And I worked with people with disabilities. And so that's not the time to be asking people to travel across the world to hang out with you in person. You can't be doing that. So our evaluation had to totally shift with it. It had to shift to an online format. And a lot of our participants weren't regularly online. So we had to really think about how are we going to continue being engaged with our program participants if we don't see them in person once a year. And we had to really shift a lot of that. Real world, it's complex. So program evaluation, you can have the best plans ever, and just like research, it will be alive, it will be iterative, it will change. And another really key consideration is that program evaluations aren't as easy to control for extraneous variables. And I'm saying it like research is easy to control for extraneous variables, and that's not true at all. But it's even worse in program evaluation because there's going to be so many things that change that because we don't have this super specific controlled research design where we're putting people into groups and we're controlling what variable we're manipulating, we can't do that in real life with real people. So you have to think more intentionally about if we're going to use comparison groups, are those actually comparable groups? And how are we controlling for all of this other variability between people's lived experiences? We have to think differently about measurement tools and research designs to try to minimize that bias while still getting strong, valid data. So extraneous variables wreak havoc on program evaluation, and it's part of why you report it a little bit differently. But again, I'll try to stay in my lane talking about this. So the process, how do we do this? How do we do this? Step one is you plan it. Before you even start doing the project or the program, you plan it. And step one is who's going to use this evaluation? Who is our audience here? And the audience are stakeholders. When I'm talking about stakeholders in terms of evaluation and programs, I'm talking about the people who have an interest in that program and its outcomes. So this tends to be three different groups of people. These tend to be funders, who's given me money, program directors, so the people who are in charge of that money. There tends to be a CEO who doesn't actually do a lot of the work a lot of the times, but is in charge of how you're spending money, allocations of finances, that sort of thing. We also want to include insight from the people who are actually delivering the program. So the staff, the administrators, the people who are actually doing that work. How do they think it's going? What obstacles are coming up for them in their day-to-day work? What's going well? What needs to be different? Where's efficiency? Where are we spending our time? How much time should we be spending in different things? And then lastly, you want to include the clients themselves, the people who the program is built for, community members, the people who are utilizing those resources. So I'm going to pick up my own experience. Like I said, I worked with people with nonprofits. So when I was doing program evaluation, I was having a three-pronged approach. I was always collecting data from our funders and from our program directors on their expectations and how they perceived it going. I was also always in contact with our staff and the people who were engaging in our day-to-day activities. And then I was also always going back to the people with those actual disabilities. Are these resources helpful? What do they want more of? What do they not need? What do they already have? This feels duplicative, that sort of thing. Step two is you want to, after we decide who is this for, we want to define the mission, goals, and services really clearly and our target population. That's a big part of writing a grant is you have really specific goals and missions that you are setting out to accomplish, and that usually is tied to a timeline. And that steps into step three of clarifying those evaluation goals. What are we trying to learn or improve? How will these results be impactful? And step four is how we actually do it. What is our design? What are our methods? What is our timeline? So when I think of program evaluation, it's not just at the end of the program. It's not at the beginning and the end of the program. It is consistent and throughout the program. But you have to think about a lot of these things in terms of how long someone needs to have the resource for it to be effective. An example of something like that is in my work, we spent a lot of time creating patient resources to help them navigate different medical experiences. But if I hand you a worksheet and a survey at the same time to say how effective is this worksheet in helping you learn how to navigate medical care, well, that's silly because they didn't actually have any time to use the information or resource that I was giving them. So we'd have to give them the resources and then maybe 6 months later, reach back out to them and ask them how effective it was. That sort of thing is all what you want to have very detailed and planned during your planning phase before you even actually deliver those resources. That should all be designed. And then we execute. We actually do the thing. The resources are made. The program is up and active, and we are collecting information the entire time. This is usually through several different approaches. Surveys are a big one. If you've ever been shopping at a Dillard's, you probably got an email after asking about your evaluation. If you go to the Olive Garden, they have the little technology on the table, and after you pay your bill, they're going to ask you to give them an evaluation. Evaluations are everywhere. You get them in phone calls, you get them at stores, you get them in emails all of the time. And those are really important. And two types of people tend to fill out those evaluations. People who are really pissed at you for a specific reason, or people who are really, really happy. And that's great, but it also causes a problem because if we're only hearing from the extremes of people who have a really bad or a really good experience, we're not actually capturing all the people in the middle. Kind of like Google reviews. I love Google reviews. I look at Google reviews before I make big purchases or before I go to a restaurant, but you got to take them with some context. People who leave Google reviews, who leave this type of evaluative feedback, tend to be either really mad or really happy and maybe even related to the restaurant owner, but that depends. It's a good source of information, but you have to understand it in the context of it being the extremes. It's part of why businesses sometimes hate the Google reviews because they aren't allowed to edit them. And it's like, okay, I served 100 people today and one of them is annoyed with me. But the only response you get on the Google form is the one who was annoyed with you, and that's the one that sticks. So surveys are great, surveys are wonderful, and especially within program evaluation, you have to remember who are the type of people who fill out those evaluations. And does that accurately represent someone's overall experience or like the overall resource itself? And the answer is usually no. So we also try to have interviews with people who, and there's usually money incentivized to do those interviews, but people who are more in the norm of the experience. And we also use a lot of focus groups where we ask lots of different members to come in and talk to each other, and a facilitator will be watching that conversation. They'll ask questions like, what do you like? What do you not like? And we're also watching how people work together in a group to form these opinions. I'll talk more about focus groups in just a second, though. So we're gathering information, we're gathering data, and then also in this execution phase, we're not just gathering data, we're also analyzing it along the way so that we can pivot and change the resources based on that data. That can be statistical, that can be qualitative. It's very often both, which is a good idea. And it helps us take that data, even while we're still running the program, and making change based on those insights to help improve the overall program. And in step 3, we take all this information, we're acting on it, and then we also have to communicate that. We have to write it up somehow. We have to share that information with the appropriate people. So we use this data, we make our conclusions, and then we have to make recommendations, usually to the stakeholders who are the funders, who hold the purse coins, and to the people who are actually delivering those resources. So we're identifying those strengths and areas for improvement consistently, but we're also reporting them in a way that can help more long-term future decision making and resource allocation. And there's just a fancy way of saying, what are we going to put money towards? What are we going to put effort towards? So we report all of this, we share it with all the stakeholders, and that includes people who aren't on your board or aren't your funders. You're also ethically responsible for sharing these evaluations with the participants themselves, which means we can't use this academic, super highfalutin language. We have to be able to talk like normal people. And so a lot of times this means we're going to, instead of writing up a peer-reviewed research article and going through all of that, we're going to do something like an infographic. We're going to give presentations at different conferences, and it's much more for a lay audience. Most of the time when you're communicating results of a program evaluation, you really want to think about, how can I communicate this in a way that anyone can understand it? It's why infographics are hit so heavily in your textbook too. They talk a lot about the role of infographics in program evaluation. I can't tell you how many infographics I've made in my life about satisfaction and how many people are attending things and all that sort of stuff. And we do it that way because it's more normal people look at it. It's not just scientists who are reading a full research article. We want to be able to convey large amounts of information quickly in a very user-friendly way. So, what are the types of program evaluation? There are 3 main types. Usually they go in this order, but not always. Usually we start at the beginning of a program with a needs assessment. So what is this program actually for? Do we actually need the resources that they are building? What services are intended to be created? And get feedback on the services before you even start doing them. So the question is, do we really need this program? Do we really need this resource? And the people who are going to be using it, what do they think about it and about us trying to do that? More towards that action and execution stage, you're going to be doing process evaluation. And that is answering the question of, is this going well? Is it being delivered the way we are intending for it to be delivered? So we're thinking about implementation, what is going right, what is going wrong. And there's more of a focus, quite literally, on the process of delivery. And we use it to adjust live time and how those things are being delivered. And then we also have outcome evaluation, which is exactly what it sounds like. And this is where we're measuring the overall program effectiveness on participants as they aligned with what we said we were going to do. So this tends to come a little bit later in the process. So the question here is, did the program achieve its goals? And it's important to note that while these tend to happen in stages, with needs usually being in planning, process usually being in that execution, and outcomes usually being in that wrap-up stage, these can also be happening simultaneously throughout the entire process. And depending on the program, it makes more or less sense to do that. Just depends. This is from your textbook and is recapping some of that information as well, but you'll know at this point that I love a good table to summarize lots of information for us. And the last thing I'll hit on is just a couple of specific research techniques that they're not unique to program evaluation, meaning they don't only happen in program evaluation, but they happen more often than they do in other forms of systematic data collection. So these are more common in program evaluation than they are in research. Not exclusive, but more common. So the first one, like I talked about a second ago, is focus groups. And what we love about focus groups is that you get to have really deep, rich, qualitative insight into how people are actually thinking and reacting to your product or to your service. And every focus group I have ever run, I always walk away learning something new that I would not have thought of, because that's not how human experience works. People experience things differently. And those are great. They're really rich. Marketing really loves focus groups for a lot of those reasons. But the con of it is they take a lot of time, and you usually have to have a pretty skilled facilitator to be able to do this. It is a specific skill to be able to elicit large and intentionally useful parts of information from a group. And it usually takes more time to analyze that data because it is qualitative. So you have to transcribe it all, you have to try themes of it all. It just takes longer. And it's not super generalizable based on what your focus group is. So if I invite 5 people, that's only 5 people's experiences. And so that's just part of the game. But you want to use it when you're exploring people's experiences of a resource or of whatever it is that program is designed to be giving people, and it's helpful for identifying improvements and how and why things are happening. Program evaluation is also much more common to use single item indicators. And what I mean by that is rather than giving someone a standardized measurement, like I'm pushing you all to do, like when I say measure anxiety, I don't mean ask them one question of how anxious are you. Usually when you find a psychometrically validated scale, it's going to be several questions getting at different facets. You're looking at how much they agree within those responses. It's stronger statistically, it's stronger validity. But in program evaluation, we use a lot of single items a lot of the times. They're a lot more prone to just saying, does this make you anxious? Or how satisfied are you with something? It's just going to ask one question to get at a concept. And a big pro of that is it's quicker and it's easier. People are already not super, on the whole, likely to fill out evaluations. You usually have to beg them or incentivize them or pay them. But if I went to Olive Garden and they wanted me to fill out 20 questions, I'm not going to do that. But if you ask me to fill out one question, I'm more likely to do it. So those single item indicators are helpful because it gets people to use them more and it's simpler. But the con of it is you get a whole lot less information, and it can oversimplify really complex ideas. So let's pick on Olive Garden. And I love Olive Garden. I'm sorry, I'm just stuck on this example. I just happened to go there yesterday. They ask you at the table, how satisfied are you with your service today? And if I only ask that question, I miss the nuance of if I'm satisfied with the food, if I'm satisfied with the environment, if I'm satisfied with the cost, if I'm satisfied with my server, if I'm satisfied with how close it is to my house, if I'm satisfied with my wait time. There's a lot of different things that go into someone's satisfaction. And if I am only asking them one big question of how satisfied are you, I'm missing a lot of the information that's needed for me to actually make adjustments to improve my service. That's why Olive Garden will ask you one question of how satisfied are you? And then once you answer it, then it takes you to another page and it'll ask you some of those more detailed questions. But people are a lot less likely to fill them out. They're more likely to fill it out if it looks like it's just one question, just how it works. And program evaluation can be kind of tricky. Always be a little sus. When you see again, I'm picking an Olive Garden. I do not know this is true. Do not take this as the truth. This is just an example for teaching purposes. And with this disclaimer, if I saw a commercial that said 90% of people who go to Olive Garden are satisfied, because I know program evaluation, I know that probably what they did was ask one question about satisfaction, probably on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 to 5 means some form of unsatisfied and 5 to 10 means some form of satisfied, with 10 being the most satisfied and 5 being like moderate. But what they'll do is they don't say, 5% of people were a 1, 2% of people were a 2, 30% of people were a 4. They don't do that. They collapse it. They say everyone who responded 5 or above, any level of satisfaction, we're just going to call that satisfied. And so 80%, 90% of people are satisfied. But you don't actually know if most of them are moderately satisfied or highly satisfied because they collapse it all. And you can do that. And it's kind of like a tricky thing they do in program evaluation. They tend to use larger Likert scales because they are going to collapse it. And psychologically, if you give people more options, they're less likely to go to the extremes. We are more likely to see some of that nuance. But if I'm the data person on the other side, I'm going to try to make it look as positive as possible and reinterpret some of that data, which you can do in program evaluation in a way that you shouldn't really be doing that in research because the goals are different. Taking us all the way back home, the point of program evaluation is to see how well something is working, whereas the point of research is to find out the truth. And it's not that those two things are not always that one, they can coexist, but how we frame our questions matter. And sometimes I want to use a single indicator because I don't want a lot of the nuance. I don't want them to tell me all the things that are wrong. I just want to be able to report to my grant funder that a large amount of people are satisfied or whatever that is. So straightforward, great for times and resources, but it can really oversimplify some of this stuff. And those are program evaluations. I like keeping this at the end because it is different from research that we've been talking about. Hopefully we were able to explain some of those differences today. But as always, reach out with any questions and I will see you all next time.